On a freezing Christmas Eve night when most families were warm inside their homes, preparing for celebration, a desperate young mother named Melissa stood shivering on a dark street corner with her twin daughters begging strangers for just a piece of bread because her babies had not eaten anything for 2 whole days and their tiny bodies were trembling from both hunger and cold. But everyone who passed by either ignored them completely or looked at them with disgust until one man stopped in his tracks when he heard the little girls crying, and that man was Joshua Miller, a single father who had lost his wife 7 years ago and knew exactly what it felt like to be alone, desperate and fighting to keep your children alive. And what Joshua did next on that cold Christmas Eve would not only change Melissa and her daughters' lives forever, but would also reveal a connection between their pasts that neither of them could have ever imagined, a connection that would prove that sometimes the people we help are the very ones who are meant to save us in return. The snow was falling heavily that Christmas Eve, and the streets were almost empty because everyone had rushed home to be with their families and celebrate the holiday. But on the corner of 5th Avenue, near an old closed-down grocery store, stood a young woman who looked no more than 25 years old, and beside her were 2 little girls who could not have been more than 5 years old, and all 3 of them were shaking uncontrollably in the freezing cold, and the young woman, whose name was Melissa, was holding a small cardboard sign that read, "Please help us. We are hungry." And her voice was barely a whisper as she tried to ask the few people who passed by if they could spare any food or even a single dollar. But most people just walked faster when they saw her, and some even crossed to the other side of the street to avoid making eye contact with her. And Melissa felt her heart breaking. Not for herself, but for her 2 daughters, Emma and Lily, who had not eaten anything since 2 days ago, when she had managed to buy them a small loaf of bread with the coins she had collected from begging. And now those coins were gone, and she had no money left and no food and nowhere to go because the shelter she had been staying at had closed down due to lack of funding, and the other shelters in the city were all full because it was Christmas Eve, and everyone who had nowhere to go was trying to find a warm place to sleep. Melissa looked down at her daughters and saw that their lips were turning blue from the cold, and their little hands were red and raw because they did not have proper gloves. And she felt like the worst mother in the world because she could not provide for them, and she could not keep them warm, and she could not even give them a decent meal. And tears started rolling down her cheeks, but she quickly wiped them away because she did not want her daughters to see her crying because she needed to be strong for them, even though inside she felt like giving up and just sitting down on the cold pavement and never getting up again. But then Emma tugged at her coat and said, "Mommy, I am so hungry and my tummy hurts." And Lily started crying too, and said, "Me too. Mommy, please, can we have something to eat?" And Melissa felt her heart shatter into a million pieces, and she hugged her daughters tightly and said, "I know, babies. I know Mommy is trying her best. I promise. We will find something to eat soon." And she said a silent prayer to God, or to anyone who was listening, and begged for help, because she did not know how much longer she could keep going like this. Just then, a man who had been walking past suddenly stopped and turned around and looked at Melissa and her daughters with an expression that was hard to read, and Melissa thought he was going to yell at them or tell them to get off the street like so many others had done. But instead, he walked closer, and his eyes were filled with concern. And he said, "Excuse me, miss, are you all right?" And Melissa was so surprised that someone was actually talking to her with kindness that she did not know what to say at first. But then she nodded and said, "Yes, sir, we are fine, thank you." But the man looked at the 2 little girls who were clinging to their mother and shivering, and he knew that they were definitely not fine. And he said, "How long have you been out here in the cold?" And Melissa hesitated, because she was afraid that if she told the truth, he might call the police or child services and take her daughters away from her. But something in his eyes made her feel like she could trust him. So she said, "We have been out here since this morning, sir, because we have nowhere else to go." And the man looked shocked, and he said, "Have you eaten anything today?" And Melissa shook her head and said, "No, sir. We have not eaten in 2 days." And that was when the man whose name was Joshua Miller felt his own heartbreak because he had been in a similar situation 7 years ago when he had lost his wife in a car accident and had been left alone to raise his young son. And he remembered how hard it had been and how many times he had gone to bed, hungry, so that his son could eat, and how he had felt like the world had abandoned him. Joshua looked at Melissa and her daughters and saw his own past reflected in their desperate situation, and he knew he had to help them because someone had helped him when he was at his lowest point, and it was because of that help that he was able to get back on his feet and build a good life for himself and his son. And now it was his turn to pay it forward. So he said, "Please let me help you. Have you and your daughters eaten anything at all?" And Melissa said, "No, sir. Like I said, we have not eaten in 2 days, and my daughters are so hungry, and I do not know what to do anymore." And Joshua felt a lump forming in his throat, and he said, "Okay, listen, I am going to take you and your daughters to get some food right now." And Melissa looked at him with wide eyes, filled with both hope and fear, and she said, "Sir, I do not have any money. I cannot pay you back." And Joshua shook his head and said, "I do not want your money. I just want to help you because I know what it is like to be in your position, and I know how hard it is." And Melissa started crying again, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. And she said, "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means to us." Joshua smiled gently and said, "Come on, let us get you all warmed up and fed." And he led Melissa and her daughters down the street to a small diner that was still open on Christmas Eve. And when they walked inside, the warm air hit them like a wave, and the little girls stopped shivering for the first time in hours. And the owner of the diner, who was a kind older woman named Betty, looked at the three of them and immediately understood what was going on. And she said, "Joshua, who are your friends here?" And Joshua said, "Betty, this is Melissa and her daughters Emma and Lily, and they need a hot meal." And Betty nodded without asking any questions and said, "Well, you all just sit down right here, and I will bring you the best Christmas Eve dinner you have ever had." And Melissa tried to thank her, but Betty waved her hand and said, "No need to thank me. Honey, it is Christmas Eve, and nobody should be hungry on Christmas Eve." They all sat down in a booth, and Joshua ordered hot chocolate for the girls and coffee for Melissa and himself. And when the food arrived, Emma and Lily looked at it like they had never seen anything so beautiful in their lives, and they started eating so fast that Melissa had to tell them to slow down because she was worried they would make themselves sick. And Joshua watched them eat and felt tears stinging his own eyes because he remembered when his son had been that hungry and he had felt so helpless. And he looked at Melissa and said, "So tell me, how did you end up in this situation?" And Melissa took a deep breath and said, "It is a long story, sir, but the short version is that my husband left us about 6 months ago, and I lost my job shortly after. That because I had to miss too many days taking care of my daughters when they were sick, and I could not afford our apartment anymore. So we got evicted and we have been staying at different shelters, but they are always full, and tonight we had nowhere to go." And Joshua listened carefully, and he said, "I am so sorry. You have had to go through all of that." And Melissa said, "It is okay, sir. You did not cause it." And Joshua said, "Please stop calling me sir. My name is Joshua." And Melissa smiled weakly and said, "Okay, Joshua, thank you for helping us," as they ate. Joshua told Melissa about his own story, about how he had lost his wife Sarah 7 years ago in a car accident, and how he had been left alone with his 5-year-old son Nathan, and how he had struggled to make ends meet and had almost lost his house, and how a kind stranger had helped him by giving him a job when no one else would hire him, and how that one act of kindness had changed his entire life. And Melissa listened with tears in her eyes, and she said, "You are a good man, Joshua, and your wife would be proud of you." And Joshua felt his throat tighten, and he said, I hope so. I try to live my life in a way that would honor her. Memory and Melissa said I can tell that you do. And Emma and Lily, who had finished eating, were now looking much better, and their cheeks had color in them again, and they were smiling and playing with the crayons that Betty had given them. After they finished eating, Joshua said, "Okay, so we need to figure out where you are going to stay tonight, because I am not going to let you sleep on the streets." And Melissa said, "I appreciate that, Joshua, but I do not want to be a burden on you, and you have already done so much for us." And Joshua said, "You are not a burden, and I have a guest room in my house that is not being used, and you and your daughters are welcome to stay there for as long as you need." And Melissa looked at him in disbelief and said, "Are you serious?" And Joshua said, "Yes, I am completely serious." And Melissa said, "But you do not even know us." And Joshua said, "I know enough, and I know that you need help, and I am in a position to help you. So please let me." And Melissa felt like she was in a dream because she could not believe that this stranger was being so kind to her and her daughters. And she said, "Okay, Joshua, if you are sure, then yes. We would love to stay with you, and thank you so much." Joshua paid for the meal and left a generous tip for Betty, and then they all left the diner and got into Joshua's car, and he drove them to his house, which was a nice, modest home in a quiet neighborhood. And when they arrived, Melissa and her daughters looked around in awe because they had not been inside a real home in months, and Joshua showed them to the guest room, which had a comfortable bed and clean sheets and warm blankets. And he said, "You can all sleep here, and there is a bathroom right across the hall, and if you need anything, just let me know." And Melissa said, "Thank you, Joshua. I do not know how we will ever repay you." And Joshua said, "You do not need to repay me. Just seeing you and your daughters safe and warm is enough for me." That night, after Melissa had put her daughters to bed, she came out of the guest room and found Joshua sitting in the living room looking at old photographs, and she said, "I hope I am not disturbing you." And Joshua said, "No, not at all. Please sit down." And Melissa sat down on the couch. And Joshua showed her the photograph he was looking at, and it was a picture of him and his wife, Sarah, and their son, Nathan, taken about 8 years ago. And Melissa said she was beautiful. And Joshua said yes, she was, and she was also the kindest person I have ever known. And Melissa said, "I am sure she was, and I am sure she would be proud of the man you have become." And Joshua smiled sadly and said, "I hope so." And then he asked Melissa about her husband, and she said his name was David, and he was wonderful at first, but then he started drinking and became abusive. And one day he just left, and I have not heard from him since. And honestly, I am glad he is gone, because my daughters and I are safer without him. Joshua and Melissa talked for hours that night, and they found that they had a lot in common, and they both understood what it was like to be a single parent, struggling to survive. And Joshua told Melissa that he owned a small construction company, and that he would be happy to give her a job if she wanted one. And Melissa said, "Are you serious?" And Joshua said, "Yes. I need someone to help with the administrative work and scheduling, and I think you would be perfect for the job." And Melissa felt tears of joy streaming down her face, and she said, "Yes, Joshua, I would love that. Thank you so much." And Joshua said, "You are welcome, and I am happy to help." Over the next few weeks, Melissa and her daughters stayed with Joshua and his son Nathan, and the 5 of them became like a family. And Melissa started working at Joshua's construction company, and she was very good at her job, and Joshua was impressed by her work ethic and dedication, and Emma and Lily became best friends with Nathan, and they played together every day, and for the first time in a long time, Melissa felt like things were finally going to be okay. And she was so grateful to Joshua for giving her and her daughters a second chance at life. One day, about a month after they had moved in, Melissa was going through some old boxes that Joshua had in the attic because she was looking for some Christmas decorations, and she found a box of old photographs and newspapers, and as she was looking through them, she saw a newspaper article from 7 years ago about a car accident, and when she read the article, her heart stopped, because the article said that a woman named Sarah Miller had died in a car accident, and that she had been on her way home from volunteering at a homeless shelter when her car was hit by a drunk driver, and Melissa felt like she could not breathe because she suddenly remembered that 7 years ago she had been volunteering at that same homeless shelter, and she had been there the day that Sarah had left, and Sarah had been so kind to her and had given her money to buy food for her infant daughters. And Melissa had never forgotten that act of kindness. And now she realized that the woman who had helped her all those years ago was Joshua's wife, and that Joshua was the husband that Sarah had talked about so lovingly. Melissa ran downstairs with the newspaper article in her hand, and she found Joshua in the kitchen, and she said, "Joshua, I need to show you something." And Joshua looked at her with concern and said, "What is it?" And Melissa showed him the article and said, "I know your wife. I knew her. She helped me 7 years ago when I was staying at a homeless shelter with my newborn daughters, and she gave me money and food, and she was so kind to me. And I never forgot her." And Joshua looked at Melissa in shock and said, "You knew Sarah?" And Melissa nodded and said yes. "And I did not realize it until now. But she is the reason I survived that terrible time in my life. And she is the reason my daughters are alive today." And Joshua felt tears streaming down his face. And he said, "I cannot believe this. Sarah always talked about the people she helped at the shelter, and she always said that she wished she could do more. And Melissa said, she did more than she will ever know. And I think about her all the time. And I have always wanted to thank her, but I never got the chance." Joshua and Melissa stood there crying and hugging each other, because they both realized that their meeting on that Christmas Eve was not a coincidence, but was fate bringing them together, because Sarah had helped Melissa 7 years ago, and now Joshua had helped Melissa and her daughters. And it was like Sarah was still watching over all of them and making sure that they were taken care of. And Joshua said, "I think Sarah brought us together, Melissa, and I think she wanted me to help you the same way she did." And Melissa said, "I think so too, and I am so grateful to both of you." And Joshua said, "And I am grateful to you, because you have brought so much joy and light back into my life, and into Nathan's life, and we were so lonely before you came, and now we feel like a family again." As time went on, Joshua and Melissa grew closer, and they fell in love, and eventually they got married, and Emma and Lily and Nathan became siblings, and they all lived together as one big happy family. And Joshua often thought about that Christmas Eve, when he had found Melissa and her daughters begging for food in the freezing cold, and he thought about how close he had come to just walking past them like everyone else had done. But something had made him stop and help them, and he knew that something was Sarah watching over him and guiding him to do the right thing, and he knew that Sarah would be happy, knowing that he had found love again, and that he was honoring her memory by helping others the way she had always done. And Melissa often thought about how she had been at her lowest point that Christmas Eve, and how she had thought that there was no hope left. But then Joshua had appeared like an angel sent from heaven, and had saved her and her daughters, and had given them a second chance at life. And she thought about Sarah and how that one act of kindness 7 years ago had set off a chain of events that had led to this beautiful life she now had, and she made a promise to herself that she would always help others the way Sarah and Joshua had helped her, because she knew that kindness was the most powerful force in the world, and that it could change lives in ways that people could never imagine. Years later on another Christmas Eve, Joshua and Melissa gathered their children around the fireplace and told them the story of how they had met and how Sarah had connected them, and the children listened with wide eyes, and Nathan said, "So Grandma Sarah is the reason we are all together." And Joshua smiled and said, "Yes. Son, she is, and even though she is not here with us, physically she is always here in spirit, watching over us and making sure we take care of each other." And Emma said, "I wish I could have met her." And Melissa said, "I think you did meet her, sweetheart, in a way, because her kindness lives on in all of us and in everything we do." And Lily said, "So we should always be kind to others like Grandma Sarah was." And Joshua said, "Exactly, and that is the greatest lesson we can learn from her, that kindness costs nothing, but it means everything, and it can change someone's entire life. And so the family continued to live by that lesson, and they made it their mission to help others who were struggling just like they had once struggled. And every Christmas Eve, they would go out and find families who needed help, and they would give them food and money and a place to stay, and they would tell them the story of Sarah and how one act of kindness had changed so many lives, and the people they helped would cry tears of gratitude just like Melissa had done that night when Joshua had stopped to help her, and they would promise to pay it forward and help others when they were able to, and in that way Sarah's legacy continued to grow and spread and touch more and more lives with each passing year, and Joshua knew that Sarah was smiling down on them from heaven, proud of the family they had become, and proud of the love and kindness they were spreading throughout the world.